If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The disappearance of a father with schizophrenia. I was 15 when my dad vanished. He had been battling schizophrenia for years, and though he'd have good stretches, his bad days could be overwhelming. Lately, things had been getting worse. He'd become convinced that people were watching him. Neighbors, strangers, even the mailman. He'd pull me aside, whispering about them, though he never explained who they were. At first, I thought it was just another episode, but then he started meeting these men. They were shady, rough-looking guys I didn't recognize, and they'd show up at weird hours. My mom would fight with him about it, but he'd always dismiss her, saying they were helping him. The last time I saw him, he was sitting in our kitchen with one of those men. They both went silent as I walked in, like I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to hear. My dad gave me this weird smile. Forced, almost apologetic. That was the night he left. He took his car, a beat-up sedan that barely ran, and didn't say where he was going. My mom thought he was just driving to cool off. He'd done it before. But when morning came and he still wasn't back, we knew something was wrong. A week later, they found his car. It was miles away, abandoned on the shoulder of a quiet back road. There was no sign of him, no wallet, no phone, nothing. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition, like he'd just stepped out and disappeared into thin air. The police searched the surrounding area but didn't find anything. No footprints, no clothes, not even a cigarette butt. It was like he'd been plucked out of existence. My mom was frantic, calling every hospital, shelter, and even the morgue. I didn't want to believe he was dead, but the longer he stayed missing, the harder it was to hold on to hope. The investigation dragged on for months. My dad's condition and the people he'd been associating with made everything murkier. The cops questioned us about the men he'd been meeting, but we didn't have names to give. One of them had tattoos on his neck, another always wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. None of them seemed like the kind of people you'd want to trust. My mom begged the police to dig deeper, but it felt like they'd already written him off. People like your dad, one officer started, before catching himself. He didn't need to finish. I knew what he meant. Years passed, and the questions only grew. What made it harder was that we never had closure. No body, no answers. Just that damn car left like a breadcrumb leading nowhere. We tried to move on, but my mom always kept his things packed away neatly, as if he might walk through the door any day. I hated it. Every time I saw those boxes, it felt like the wound was being reopened. I'd tell myself he was still alive somewhere, that maybe he'd just run away, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Not the way he left. Not without saying goodbye. Then, 3 years ago, something happened that shook me to my core. I was leaving work late one night when two men approached me outside the parking lot. At first, I thought they were just random strangers asking for directions, but when one of them said my dad's name, my heart sank. They asked if I was his kid, and when I hesitated, they smiled, like they already knew the answer. One of them said, "Your dad and I go way back," but I'd never seen these guys in my life. Their faces were hard to read, too friendly, too casual. It didn't feel right. I asked them what they wanted, trying to sound braver than I felt. One of them, the taller guy with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, just shrugged. "Just checking in," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The other guy, shorter and wiry, leaned in closer and said, "Your dad still owes us." That phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. Owes them. Owes them what? Before I could even process it, they were already walking away. No explanations, no answers, just that cryptic remark hanging in the air. I called after them, but they didn't even turn around. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told my mom, but she brushed it off as some cruel prank. "People will say anything," she said, though I could tell it rattled her. I couldn't let it go, though. What did they mean? Were these men tied to the people my dad had been meeting before he disappeared? I even went to the police, but without any names or descriptions beyond 2 random guys, they couldn't do much. It felt like the same old story all over again. More questions, no answers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something about what really happened to my dad. A few weeks later, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. A black car parked across the street from my apartment for hours at a time. The same man sitting in the corner booth of the diner I always stopped at before work. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just paranoia, a side effect of the stress, but the patterns were too deliberate to ignore. One night, as I was locking up my place, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe someone passing by, but the street was empty. Just me and the quiet hum of the streetlights. Then, 2 nights later, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was a plain piece of paper with 2 words scrawled in black marker. "Stop asking." That was it. No signature, no explanation. My stomach turned as I stared at it. Stop asking about what? I hadn't been actively asking anyone anything, at least not recently. I threw the note away, but it didn't stop the sense of dread creeping over me. Whoever these people were, they knew where I lived. They were watching me. And if they knew that much, what else did they know? After that note, I couldn't shake the feeling that my dad's disappearance was more than just some tragic, unsolved case. Something, or someone, was keeping the truth buried. I started retracing his steps from before he vanished, reaching out to old friends, people he used to work with, even a few neighbors who remembered him. Most didn't have much to say, but one guy, an older man who used to fix cars with my dad, got quiet when I mentioned those sketchy men he'd been meeting. "If I were you, I'd leave that alone," he said, refusing to look me in the eye. "Your dad got himself mixed up in something dangerous." That word, dangerous, stuck with me. It made my chest tighten, like I was in over my head without even knowing it. A few days after that conversation, I came home to find my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but someone had definitely been inside. Drawers were slightly open, papers had been shuffled. The only thing out of place was a single photo from a box of family pictures I kept under my bed. It was one of the few I had of my dad, taken years before his schizophrenia worsened. The photo had been placed face up on my kitchen table, as if whoever was there wanted me to see it. That photo on the table rattled me. It was such a small, deliberate thing, but it felt like a message. I stared at it for hours that night, trying to piece together what it meant. My dad looked so carefree in it, smiling with me on his shoulders at a park we used to visit. Whoever had been in my apartment could have taken it, or left something more threatening, but they didn't. It felt personal, almost like they were trying to remind me of something, or maybe warn me. The next day, I decided to drive out to where his car had been found all those years ago. I hadn't been there since the initial search, but something about revisiting the spot felt necessary, like it might shake something loose in my memory. The road was eerily quiet, flanked by dense woods on either side. When I got there, I pulled over and just sat in my car, staring at the empty shoulder. The pavement was cracked, weeds growing through it, but otherwise, it looked the same. I stepped out, half expecting to feel something, some gut instinct, some clue I'd missed before, but all I felt was this overwhelming emptiness. As I stood there, staring into the woods, I felt like I wasn't alone. The air was still, but there was this strange, suffocating weight to it, like something was watching me. I told myself it was just my nerves, but then I noticed it, a faint indentation in the dirt near the tree lean. It wasn't fresh, but it was shaped like a footprint, and it was big, far larger than mine. My first thought was that it had to be from years ago, maybe from the original search, but something about it didn't sit right. The edges weren't weathered enough, and it looked like whoever made it had been barefoot. I took a few steps toward the trees, my heart racing. Part of me wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something, even if I didn't know what. As I got closer, I noticed broken branches, like someone, or something, had pushed through the underbrush. I followed the trail for a few feet before I saw it, a rusted key ring hanging from a low branch. My dad's car keys. I froze, staring at them like they might bite me. They'd been here the whole time, untouched, waiting. But why hadn't anyone found them before? And how the hell did they end up in the woods when his car was left by the road? My hands were shaking as I reached for the keys. The metal was cold and rusted. The plastic fob cracked like it had been out there for years. Holding them felt surreal, like I was touching a piece of my dad that I thought I'd never see again. But then a wave of dread hit me. Someone had to have put them there. They didn't just fall out of the car and walk into the woods on their own. Was it whoever left the photo in my apartment? Was it one of those men who approached me? And why now, after all this time? I didn't stay to find out. Clutching the keys, I ran back to my car, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me or see someone lurking in the shadows. The woods were silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. When I got back to the car, I locked the doors and drove home, my mind racing the entire way. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. And whoever had left those keys wanted me to know it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the keys on my nightstand, staring at them like they might give me answers if I looked long enough. Instead, they just raised more questions. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hey, I found my missing dad's car keys in the woods after 10 years? It sounded insane. And worse, I couldn't shake the fear that whoever left them there was still watching me. The next morning, I got a text from an unknown number. It was just one word. Found. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence, some random spam message. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whoever sent it knew about the keys. My hands were shaking as I deleted the text, but it didn't make the fear go away. It felt like a warning, or maybe a threat. Either way, I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ignored it. After that text, I started to unravel. Every creak in my apartment, every shadow in my peripheral vision, felt like someone closing in on me. I took a few days off work, hoping the break would help me clear my head, but it only gave me more time to obsess over the keys and that message. I couldn't stop wondering if I'd missed something out there in the woods. What if the keys were just the start? Against every instinct screaming at me to let it go, I decided to go back. This time, I brought a flashlight and a pocket knife, more for my own sanity than any real protection. When I got to the spot where I'd found the keys, the woods felt different, heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I retraced my steps, scanning the ground for anything else that might have been left behind. That's when I noticed it. A faint line of disturbed dirt, like something had been dragged through the underbrush. It led deeper into the trees, and before I could talk myself out of it, I followed. The trail of disturbed dirt wound through the trees, leading me farther from the road. With every step, the air seemed colder, heavier. The flashlight's beam jittered in my shaky hand, bouncing off tree trunks and tangles of branches. I kept telling myself I'd turn back any second, but the trail felt like a thread I couldn't let go of. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made me stop cold. A small clearing with what looked like an old, crumbling shed in the center. The shed looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. But there were fresh marks on the ground, footprints leading to the door. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I felt like I was being pulled forward, even though every part of me wanted to run. When I finally pushed the door open, the flashlight caught something inside, a stack of papers, neatly arranged on a dusty table. And on top of them, there was another photo. This time, it wasn't just my dad. It was me. The photo stopped me in my tracks. It was recent, taken within the last few months, maybe even weeks. I was standing outside my apartment, looking down at my phone, completely unaware someone had been watching me. My blood turned ice cold. Whoever left it here wasn't just toying with me. They were following me, tracking me, and they wanted me to know it. My first instinct was to grab the photo and run, but as I reached for it, I noticed the stack of papers beneath it. The papers were covered in handwritten notes, scribbles, and symbols that didn't make any sense to me. Some of it looked like my dad's handwriting, messy, uneven, just like it had been in the last years before he disappeared. But other parts were different, almost like someone else had added to it. The notes mentioned them repeatedly, just like my dad used to. They're always watching. They know where I am. One line sent a shiver down my spine. They'll come for you next. I couldn't stay in that shed any longer. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I stuffed the photo and a handful of the papers into my bag and bolted back to my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched, like the trees themselves had eyes. I didn't even look back to see if someone was following me. I couldn't. When I finally slammed my car door shut and locked it, I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. This was connected to my dad, to his disappearance, and now to me. At home, I spread the papers out on my kitchen table, trying to make sense of them. There were more phrases about them, fragmented thoughts about betrayal, and even a crude map of the woods where I'd found the keys and the shed. But what stood out most was a name scrawled across several of the pages. Marcus. I didn't recognize it, but it was circled so many times it had to mean something. My dad hadn't mentioned anyone named Marcus before he disappeared, at least not to me. Whoever this person was, they were important enough to be at the center of his paranoia, or maybe they were the reason for it. I spent hours researching that name, scouring old contacts of my dad's, searching online, even looking through police reports tied to his disappearance. But nothing came up. Marcus might as well have been a ghost. Frustrated, I decided to call the one person who might know something. My dad's old coworker, the guy who had warned me to leave it alone. When I mentioned the name, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he let out a sigh. "You're digging in the wrong places," he said. "If you want answers, you won't find them here." He hung up before I could ask anything else. That night, I felt like I was being watched again. It was just a feeling at first, but then I noticed subtle things. My curtains, which I was sure I had closed, were slightly open. The porch light I always left on had been turned off. I barely slept, every sound in the apartment making me jump. When morning finally came, I checked my front door and found something wedged underneath it, another photo. This one showed the shed I'd been in, but the door was wide open. Scrawled across the bottom in shaky black ink was a single word: run. That word, run, was burned into my mind. Someone knew I had been at the shed, and worse, they were telling me to leave this alone or face whatever was coming. I wanted to pack up and leave town, pretend this nightmare wasn't happening, but I knew I wouldn't get any peace if I did. So, I did the opposite of what the note warned. I grabbed the photo and papers and drove straight to the police station. I figured even if they couldn't help, at least there'd be a record of what was happening. The officer I spoke to didn't seem impressed. He gave me the same disinterested look I'd seen years ago when my dad first went missing. "We'll look into it," he said, barely glancing at the photo. As I turned to leave, though, something shifted. A younger officer standing nearby glanced at the photo on the desk, his brow furrowing. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, stepping closer. I told him about the shed, the keys, the strange men, and the notes. His expression darkened. "That shed," he said, lowering his voice. "We found another car near there years ago. Belonged to a guy named Marcus Wills. He's been missing even longer than your dad." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Marcus. The same name from the papers. My stomach churned as the officer explained that Marcus Wills had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to my dad's. His car had been abandoned not far from where I'd found the shed, and there were rumors he'd been involved with dangerous people, but nothing concrete ever came of it. The case had gone cold years ago, just like my dad's. "You're saying they're connected?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer hesitated, glancing at his colleague before nodding slightly. "They could be," he said. "But if they are, you're stirring something best left buried." I didn't need him to tell me that. I could feel it in my bones. But now, I was in too deep to back out. When I got home, I went through the papers again, combing over every detail, hoping something would jump out at me. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner of one page, half hidden beneath a scribbled sentence, there was a symbol. It was crude, almost like a child's drawing, but unmistakable, a triangle with a single eye in the center. I'd seen it before years ago, carved into the wooden armrest of my dad's favorite chair. At the time, I thought it was just one of his paranoid habits. Now, I wasn't so sure. Seeing that symbol sent a chill through me. I remembered my dad obsessively scratching it into random surfaces. Furniture, the walls of the garage, even the back of an old photo frame. At the time, my mom had chalked it up to his illness, something to ignore. But now, it felt deliberate, like he was trying to leave a message. The more I stared at it, the more it felt like it was staring back at me. I decided to dig through the box of my dad's belongings that my mom had kept in the attic. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale, but I tore through it like a madman. There were old tools, crumpled receipts, notebooks filled with his erratic handwriting, and then, buried at the bottom, a folder. Inside were more sketches of the same symbol and what looked like letters to someone, letters he'd never sent. Most were incoherent ramblings, but one line in particular made my blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, they'll come for you. Stay hidden." I stared at the word "you," my heart pounding. Was it meant for me? For my mom? Or someone else entirely? Before I could think it through, my phone buzzed on the floor where I'd left it. It was another text from the unknown number. "It's not safe. Stop digging." The text threw me into a panic. My mind raced, wondering who was behind it and how they always seemed to know exactly what I was doing. It didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a threat. I decided then and there that I couldn't do this alone anymore. I needed help, someone who could make sense of this mess. Against my better judgment, I reached out to the younger officer from the station, the one who had mentioned Marcus Wills. I didn't give him everything over the phone, just enough to convince him to meet me in person. We met at a coffee shop far from my apartment, and I brought the folder with me. The officer's face was tense as I laid out everything. The shed, the photo, the papers, and finally, the symbol. His expression darkened when I showed it to him. "We've seen that before," he said quietly, glancing around like he was afraid someone might overhear. "It's come up in a few other cases. Not just your dad's or Marcus's. There have been disappearances, people tied to the same kind of circles. Drifters, addicts, people nobody looks for too hard." He paused, lowering his voice even more. "It's not random. This is organized. And if you're seeing this symbol, you're in danger. Hearing those words felt like a death sentence. Organized. I asked, my voice cracking. What does that mean? Who are they? The officer shook his head. I don't know. And that's the truth. But there's a pattern here, and it's deliberate. Every time someone gets close to exposing them, they disappear. His words hung in the air, and I could see the conflict in his face, like he wanted to help, but knew how dangerous it was. If you're smart, you'll walk away from this, he added. They're watching you now. They'll know if you push too far. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. The texts, the photos, the feeling of being followed, it was all too real. But walking away wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just about my dad. It was about me too, and whatever I'd been dragged into. Before we parted, the officer gave me his card. Call me if anything else happens, he said. But be careful. They have a way of making people disappear without a trace. That night, I barely slept. I barricaded the door to my apartment and kept the lights on, but it didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing. When I finally got the courage to peek through the blinds, there was no one there. Just the empty street. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. The next morning, I woke up to a soft knocking at my door. It wasn't loud, more like someone tapping with their knuckles, just enough to be heard. My heart sank. I wasn't expecting anyone, and after the last few days, every little noise felt like a threat. I grabbed the pocket knife I'd started keeping on me and approached the door slowly. Who is it? I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. Just silence. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. He was older, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice muffled through the door. It's about your father. My breath caught. He didn't sound aggressive, but there was something cold in his tone that sent shivers down my spine. I don't know you, I said. Go away, or I'm calling the cops. The man sighed, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave. But then he said something that stopped me cold. You're running out of time, he muttered. They're already here. Those words hit me like a freight train. They're already here. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. No footsteps, no sound. Just the empty hallway stretching in both directions. My hands were shaking as I double-checked the locks and shoved a chair under the doorknob. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to figure out what to do next. I wanted to call the officer from the coffee shop, but what could I even say? Some creepy guy came to my door and told me I'm running out of time. It sounded insane, but every instinct in my body told me this was escalating. Whoever was behind all this wasn't just watching anymore, they were closing in. That night, I had the worst nightmare I've ever experienced. I was back in the woods, standing in front of the shed, but this time it was lit from within, a faint yellow glow spilling out through the cracks. I stepped inside, and the walls were covered in that symbol, the triangle with the eye, scratched into every surface. In the center of the room, there was a chair, and someone was sitting in it. It was my dad. His head was down, his hands tied behind his back. When he looked up, his eyes were wild, filled with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a guttural scream. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, the scream from my dreams still echoing in my ears. For a second, I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. The room felt too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore how vivid it had been, how real. And then I saw it, the same symbol from the dream, crudely drawn on the inside of my bedroom window, in what looked like condensation. I froze, my blood running cold. I hadn't opened that window in days, and I knew for a fact that the symbol hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been inside while I slept. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and called the officer's number from the coffee shop. It rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice groggy but alert. "I need help," I blurted out, my words tumbling over each other. "They've been in my apartment. They left something on my window." His tone shifted immediately. "Get out of there," he said firmly. "Don't pack anything. Don't wait. Just go." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, not even bothering to look back. My heart was pounding as I ran to my car, every shadow in the parking lot feeling like it was alive, watching me. As soon as I got inside, I locked the doors and floored it, with no idea where I was going. I just needed to be away. My mind was racing with everything the officer had said. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real. I ended up parking at an all-night diner on the edge of town. It was brightly lit, with a few cars in the lot, and for the first time in days, I felt a small sense of safety. I called the officer again, and he picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" he asked. I gave him the name of the diner, and he told me to stay put. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice tense. "But don't go outside for anything. Do you hear me? Not for anything." I hung up and tried to steady my breathing, but the fear wouldn't let go. As I sat there, staring out the window at the empty road, I noticed something. A car parked at the far end of the lot. Black, unmarked, with its headlights off. It hadn't been there when I pulled in. The sight of the car sent a jolt of panic through me. It wasn't moving, but its presence felt deliberate, like whoever was inside wanted me to know they were there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a random coincidence, but every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. I locked eyes on it, refusing to look away, afraid that if I blinked, it might get closer. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness behind me. A patrol car pulled into the lot, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The officer from the coffee shop stepped out, his face grim as he scanned the area. He spotted me through the diner window and gestured for me to stay put as he approached the black car. What happened next made my blood run cold. As he got closer, the black car's engine roared to life, and it peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. The officer tried to flag it down, but it was gone in seconds, disappearing into the night. He hurried inside, his expression tense. "We need to move," he said, barely giving me time to grab my things. "They're not messing around anymore." We left the diner in his patrol car, and he didn't waste time. The streets blurred past us as he drove, his grip tight on the wheel. "Whoever's behind this," he said, "they're watching your every move. That car didn't show up by chance. They were waiting for you." His words only confirmed what I'd feared all along. There was no escaping this. Not really. He took me to a safe house, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town that looked abandoned from the outside. Inside, it was bare but functional. A cot, a table, and little else. "You'll stay here for now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll regroup in the morning." I wanted to push for more answers, but I could tell he was on edge, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he glanced out the windows. "Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone but me," he said before leaving. The silence in the safe house was unbearable. I tried to distract myself, going through the papers I'd grabbed from the shed, but my mind kept wandering back to that car and the dream I'd had about my dad. Was he still out there somewhere? Did he know what I was dealing with? Or was this all because of him? As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard it. Faint footsteps outside the door. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter of the safe house. I froze, barely daring to breathe, straining to listen. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. They wanted me to hear them. My mind raced. Was it the officer coming back? Or was it them? I glanced at the lock on the door, silently praying it would hold. The footsteps stopped directly outside. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I watched the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. Instead, there was a light tapping, almost like the knock I'd heard at my apartment. "I know you're in there," a voice said, low and calm. It wasn't the officer. The voice was deep, unfamiliar, and carried a cold edge that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond, hoping they'd go away, but the tapping turned into a heavier knock. "We just want to talk," the voice said. "Open the door." I stayed frozen, gripping the pocket knife in my hand, though I knew it wouldn't do much if they got in. Then came the worst part: silence. The knocking stopped, and so did the voice. I waited for what felt like hours, every second stretching into eternity, but no one came in. When I finally worked up the courage to check the door, there was a new symbol scratched into the wood, the triangle with the eye, just like in my dad's notes. Beneath it was one word, crudely carved: tomorrow. That one word, tomorrow, felt like a ticking time bomb. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever left it had been close enough to touch the door, close enough to get to me if they wanted. They were toying with me, and it felt like a warning, or worse, a promise. I locked every window and door in the safe house again, even though I knew it wouldn't stop them if they wanted to get in. The night stretched on endlessly. Every little noise made me jump, every creak and groan of the old building setting my nerves on edge. I kept replaying the officer's words in my head. "This is organized. You're in danger." He'd known more than he let on, and I was starting to wonder if even he could keep me safe. By the time dawn broke, I hadn't slept at all. I sat by the window, watching the empty street outside, waiting for something to happen. At 7 a.m., the officer arrived, his face pale and drawn. "We don't have much time," he said, stepping inside and bolting the door behind him. "There's been movement. They're escalating." I didn't need him to explain. The word tomorrow had already told me enough. "What do they want from me?" I asked, my voice cracking. He hesitated, then said, "Not just you. It's about your dad. And whatever he knew." His words hit me like a gut punch. Whatever he knew. I thought back to the papers, the symbols, the cryptic warnings. My dad had always seemed paranoid, but what if it wasn't just his illness? What if he'd stumbled onto something real? What did he know? I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We don't know for sure, but he was involved with a group, people who operate off the grid, under the radar. They don't like attention, and they don't leave loose ends." That was when I realized how deep this went. My dad's paranoia wasn't random, and his disappearance wasn't just bad luck. He'd gotten tangled up in something far bigger than himself, and now it was dragging me down with him. "We need to leave," the officer said suddenly, his hand resting on his gun. "They know where you are, and they won't wait long." He ushered me into his car, the urgency in his voice leaving no room for argument. As we pulled out onto the road, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, the black car from the diner. It was trailing us at a distance, its headlights off. "They're following us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer glanced in the mirror and cursed under his breath. "Hold on," he said, gripping the wheel tighter. He floored it, the tires screeching as we sped down the road, the black car accelerating to keep up. The car chase was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The officer swerved onto side streets, trying to lose them, but the black car stuck to us like a shadow. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see it getting closer, but it stayed just far enough back to keep us in sight. "They're not trying to catch us," the officer muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They're herding us." His words sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Herding us? Toward what? I wanted to scream at him to stop, to turn around, but before I could say anything, he took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The black car followed, its headlights flickering on for the first time. They weren't hiding anymore. Up ahead, the road ended in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. The officer slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park. "Get out," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Run into the woods and don't stop. I'll hold them off." I froze, my brain unable to process what he was saying. "Go," he shouted, and something in his tone snapped me out of it. I threw the door open and ran, the crunch of gravel under my feet drowned out by the roar of the black car pulling into the clearing behind us. The forest swallowed me almost immediately, the trees pressing in from all sides. Every branch that snapped underfoot sounded like a gunshot, and every shadow felt alive. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. Behind me, I heard shouting, voices I didn't recognize. Then a gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and deafening. I stumbled, my heart hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had no idea where I was going, just deeper into the woods, away from the clearing. The shouting grew faint, then stopped altogether, leaving only the pounding of my pulse and the rustling of leaves. I found a small hollow beneath an uprooted tree and crawled inside, pressing myself against the dirt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pocket knife I'd pulled from my bag. Minutes passed like hours. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crushing twigs and leaves as they moved through the forest. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. They knew I was out here, and they were taking their time. My chest tightened as the footsteps grew louder, stopping just a few feet from my hiding spot. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my fingers ached. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, their shadow stretching across the ground. Then, in a low, chilling voice, they said one word, "Found." That single word sent a jolt of terror through me. Found. They knew exactly where I was. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, every muscle locked in place. The figure didn't move, just stood there, their presence looming. Then, slowly, I heard the scrape of something being dragged along the ground, like metal on stone. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I bolted from the hollow, adrenaline surging through me, and sprinted deeper into the woods. I didn't look back, too terrified of what I might see. Branches scratched my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush, but I didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as I could between me and whoever, or whatever, was back there. Then I saw it, the faint outline of a structure up ahead, just visible through the trees. Another shed, or maybe an old cabin. I hesitated, unsure if it was a trap, but the sound of footsteps closing in behind me made the decision for me. I ran to the door and shoved it open, slamming it shut behind me. Inside, the air was musty, the room dimly lit by cracks of sunlight filtering through the walls. My heart sank when I saw what was inside. There, on a small wooden table, was another photo. This time, it wasn't just me or my dad. It was the officer. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and scrawled across the bottom in the same crude handwriting was a single word: next. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening until it felt like I couldn't breathe. Next. That single word echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. The officer had tried to help me, but now he was part of this nightmare. I didn't even know if he was still alive. My hands trembled as I backed away from the table, scanning the room for anything that could help me. The place was empty except for the photo and a single lantern on the floor, its dim light flickering. Then I noticed something else. On the far wall, scratched deep into the wood, was the same symbol, the triangle with the eye. This one was larger than any I'd seen before, taking up nearly the entire wall. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, compelled to examine it despite every instinct telling me to run. At the center of the triangle, etched in jagged letters, was a name, Marcus. A noise outside snapped me out of my daze, a sharp rustling, followed by muffled voices. They'd found me again. I turned off the lantern and crouched in the shadows, my heartbeat so loud I was sure they could hear it. The voices grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. "Check inside," one of them said, his tone cold and detached. The doorknob rattled. The doorknob rattled harder, followed by a heavy thud as someone tried to force it open. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I clutched the pocket knife, knowing it wouldn't make a difference if they got in. The door groaned, the wood splintering slightly under the pressure. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Then, just as I thought the door would give way, the noise stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. I strained to listen, every nerve on edge, but I couldn't hear anything outside. No footsteps, no voices. Just nothing. It felt wrong, like the silence itself was a trap. My hands were slick with sweat as I tightened my grip on the knife. Suddenly, the lantern flickered back to life, its dim glow casting jagged shadows across the room. I hadn't touched it, and it had been completely off. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. They were playing with me, testing me. Then, on the wall next to the triangle symbol, fresh words appeared, etched into the wood as if by an invisible hand. I watched, frozen, as the letters formed a new message. "You can't run forever." I stared at the words, my breath caught in my throat. "You can't run forever." It wasn't just a threat, it felt like a sentence. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stand, clutching the pocket knife like it could somehow protect me. I knew staying in that cabin was a death sentence. They wanted me cornered, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I crept toward the door, my ears straining for any sound outside. Nothing. Just that oppressive silence again. I braced myself, counted to 3, and yanked the door open. The clearing was empty. No sign of the men, no sign of anything out of place. It was almost too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As I stepped outside, I felt it again, that crushing sensation of being watched. I spun around, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. I didn't waste any more time. I ran, my feet pounding against the dirt, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. That's when I heard it. A voice, low and distorted, whispering from somewhere in the trees. "This is your last chance," it said, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't stop to look. I just ran, faster than I thought possible, my lungs burning with every breath. But the voice followed me, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, twisting around me like it was coming from inside my own head. "You can't hide," it taunted, the words dripping with malice. My legs burned, my body screaming for me to stop, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. The wood seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I ran. Then, suddenly, I tripped. My foot caught on something, roots, maybe, or a rock, and I went sprawling to the ground, the pocket knife flying from my hand. Pain shot through my knees and palms as I hit the dirt. Gasping, I scrambled to my feet, but I froze when I saw what I'd tripped over. It wasn't roots. It wasn't a rock. It was another car key. It looked just like the ones I'd found in the woods earlier, the ones that belonged to my dad. My stomach churned as I picked it up, my hands trembling. That's when I realized it wasn't just lying there. It was stuck in something, driven deep into the bark of a tree, like someone had deliberately placed it there. Above it, carved into the tree trunk, was the symbol again, the triangle with the eye. And below that, a new message: "It ends here." The voice didn't stop, repeating the same phrase over and over. "This is your last chance." It was everywhere, surrounding me, chasing me. My legs were shaking, my breath ragged, but I kept running. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A dark figure darted between the trees, too fast and too close for comfort. I veered off the path, cutting through thicker brush, the branches clawing at my arms and face. The figure followed, always just at the edge of my vision, like it was hurting me again. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't keep running forever, and I had no idea where I was. The woods all looked the same, an endless maze of shadows and trees. Then, up ahead, I spotted something that stopped me in my tracks, a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. In the center stood an enormous tree, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands. At its base was a crude stone altar, and etched into the bark of the tree was the triangle symbol, larger than I'd ever seen it. The voice grew louder, clearer, as if it were coming from the tree itself. "This is where it ends," it said, sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to go near that altar, but I felt drawn to it, like the air itself was pulling me forward. I approached the altar reluctantly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But my feet moved on their own, like I wasn't in control anymore. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. The symbol carved into the tree seemed to pulse in the moonlight, like it was alive. On the altar lay something that made my stomach twist: my dad's watch. The old, scratched-up watch he never took off, the one my mom and I found missing from his belongings after he disappeared. My hand trembled as I reached out and picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so, and as I turned it over, I saw something etched into the metal backing: Marcus. The whispering voice stopped, replaced by complete silence. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me, but the clearing was empty. Then, from the shadows, I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, growing louder. My grip tightened around the pocket knife as I backed toward the tree, my heart hammering in my chest. A figure emerged from the tree lean. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, it spoke, its voice low and hollow. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure's words froze me in place. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. My grip on the pocket knife tightened, but I knew it was useless against whatever, or whoever, this was. The figure took a step closer, and for the first time, the moonlight caught its face. It wasn't a stranger. It was my dad. But it wasn't him, not really. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken and empty, like all the life had been drained out of him. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "You have to stop," he said, his voice trembling, as if it was struggling to come out. "If you keep digging, they'll take you too." Tears blurred my vision as I shook my head. "Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, his expression pained. "They're watching," he said, his voice growing quieter with each word. "They're always watching." Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling like it was empty, like a suit with no one inside. The clearing fell silent again, but the oppressive weight in the air didn't lift. I stumbled backward, unable to look away from the lifeless shell lying on the ground. From behind me, the voice returned, louder this time, echoing through the clearing. "Now it's your turn." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, my knife raised, but there was no one there. Just the tree, the altar, and the unbearable silence. The air grew colder, biting at my skin, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble faintly, as if something deep below was stirring. Then I heard it, movement, not just from one direction, but all around me. Shadows flickered between the trees, too fast to focus on. I backed up until I hit the tree, the rough bark digging into my shoulders. "Stay away," I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. The shadows stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't my dad this time. It was someone I didn't recognize. A tall man in a black coat, his face partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat. His eyes glinted in the moonlight, sharp and unrelenting. "You've gone too far," he said, his voice deep and calm, as if he were scolding a child. "We warned you." He gestured toward the altar with a slow, deliberate motion. "But you couldn't leave it alone, could you?" I shook my head, trembling. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out. "It's not about what we want," he replied, taking a step closer. "It's about balance. Your father upset it. Now it falls to you." His words made no sense, but the way he said them filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. Balance. What did he mean by that? I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but my throat felt like it was closing up. My back pressed harder against the tree as he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "You don't understand," he said, his voice almost pitying. "This was never about you. It was always about him." He nodded toward the empty shell of my dad's body lying on the ground, lifeless and crumpled. "But you've seen too much. You've come too far. There's no turning back now." I shook my head, trying to fight back the panic rising in my chest. "I didn't ask for this," I shouted, the words coming out broken. "I just wanted to find him." The man tilted his head, his face unreadable. "And now you have," he said simply, his tone flat. He raised a hand, pointing toward the altar. "The question is, will you take his place?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, unable to process what he'd just said. What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You don't need to understand," he replied, his hand still outstretched. "You just need to choose." I stood frozen, the man's words echoing in my mind. Take his place? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't form the words. My hands trembled as I clutched the pocket knife, though it felt useless now. "I'm not doing anything," I finally managed to say, my voice shaky but defiant. The man's expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. "You don't understand the stakes," he said. "Your father made a choice. He stepped out of line, and this is the price." He gestured again to the crumpled figure of my dad, and my stomach churned. "But the balance doesn't reset unless someone takes his place. That's how it's always been. That's how it will always be." I shook my head, my back pressed so hard against the tree that it hurt. "No," I whispered. "I'm not doing it. I won't." For the first time, the man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think refusing will save you?" he asked, his voice almost mocking. "This isn't a negotiation. The question isn't if, it's when." The ground beneath me trembled again, harder this time, and I felt something shift in the air, a deep, low vibration that seemed to come from the tree itself. The symbol carved into the bark began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the vibration. The man stepped back, his eyes fixed on me. "Choose," he said again, his voice sharp and final. "Take his place, or watch everything you love be taken from you." The ground shook harder, and the pulsing light from the symbol cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The man's words hung over me like a noose. Take his place, or lose everything. I didn't even know what that meant, but the weight of it was crushing. "I can't," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't." "You think any of this is about what you want?" he interrupted, his voice cutting through my panic like a blade. "Your father thought he could escape the consequences too. And now you're here because of him." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the altar. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than him. But someone must pay the price." I looked down at the watch in my hand, its cold metal biting into my skin. My dad's watch, the only piece of him I'd found after all these years. It was a symbol of everything I'd lost, everything I'd fought for, and now it felt like a weight dragging me down. "If I take his place," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what happens to me?" The man tilted his head, the faint smile returning to his face. "You'll become part of the balance," he said cryptically. "Like him." He gestured to my dad's body again, his voice calm and detached. "But those you love will be spared. That's the trade." The trembling ground grew more violent, cracks forming beneath my feet. The tree pulsed brighter, its glow almost blinding. "Choose," the man said one last time, his voice commanding. I closed my eyes, gripping the watch tightly, and whispered the only word I could manage. "Okay." The moment the word left my lips, the air seemed to change. The trembling stopped, the pulsing light from the tree dimmed, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. My legs felt weak, and I dropped to my knees, still clutching my dad's watch. The man stood over me, his face expressionless. "It's done," he said simply, as if I'd signed a contract I couldn't understand. "What happens now?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the tree line, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Before he disappeared into the shadows, he stopped and glanced back at me. "Your father would be proud," he said, his voice laced with something that might have been mockery or pity. Then he was gone. I sat there, alone in the clearing, the weight of what I'd done crushing me. The tree stood silent and still now, the symbol faded into the bark as if it had never been there. My dad's body was gone too, vanished, leaving nothing behind. I waited for something to happen, some sign of what I'd just unleashed, but the forest remained still. When I finally mustered the strength to leave, I found my way back to the road and collapsed on the shoulder, too exhausted to think. At sunrise, a passing car stopped, and the driver called for help. I told the paramedics I was lost in the woods after a hike, and they didn't press me for details. That was months ago, but I haven't been able to move on. The man's words haunt me. "You'll become part of the balance." I don't know what that means, but strange things have started happening. People I don't know look at me like they recognize me. Shadows seem to linger just a little too long. And last night, when I glanced in the mirror, I swore I saw my dad's face staring back at me. I think it's starting. The Gambler Father's Debt and Mysterious Pursuers. It started around 9 p.m., a couple of weeks after my dad disappeared. I was in the kitchen, reheating leftovers for dinner when the doorbell rang. It was one of those old mechanical chimes that echoed too loud in our quiet house, and it immediately set me on edge. My mom, already jittery from everything that had been going on, peeked through the blinds before opening the door. Two men were standing on the porch, both wearing plain clothes but flashing badges. They said they were detectives looking for my dad, and the way they spoke, sharp and rehearsed, felt off. My mom hesitated but eventually let them in, and as soon as they stepped into the house, the air seemed to change. The taller one started asking questions: where my dad was, when we'd last seen him, if we knew anything about his gambling debts. My mom kept answering nervously, but I could see her hands shaking. The shorter guy wandered off into the living room without asking, looking around like he owned the place. Something about it didn't feel right. They weren't writing anything down, no notebooks, no forms. When my mom asked for their names and department, they avoided the question, saying it was classified. That's when I realized they weren't cops. They didn't have the stiff professionalism or even the fake warmth you'd expect. They were too aggressive, too invasive. My heart started pounding because I didn't know who they were or what they really wanted. After about 10 minutes of their questioning, the taller one turned to me. I wasn't expecting it, so I froze when he barked, "You live here too, don't you? You must have seen something." His tone wasn't curious, it was accusing, like he was trying to rattle me. I stammered something about not knowing anything, avoiding eye contact, but he wasn't having it. He stepped closer, towering over me, and I could feel his breath on my face. My mom told him to back off, her voice shaky but firm. That's when the shorter guy came back from the living room holding one of my dad's old watches. "Nice piece," he said casually, as if he hadn't just ransacked our house without permission. My mom snapped then. She told them to leave, her voice rising in panic, but they didn't even flinch. The taller one leaned in closer to her and said, "You don't get to tell us what to do. Not until your husband pays up." My stomach dropped. That was it, confirmation that they weren't cops. My mom tried to stand her ground, but she was trembling, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. I wanted to do something, to say something, but I was frozen. Just when I thought things were about to spiral, the shorter guy laughed, nudged the taller one, and said, "Let's go. They're not gonna give us anything." And just like that, they left, calm, almost amused, leaving the door wide open behind them. After they left, the silence in the house felt suffocating. My mom locked the door, double-checking it twice before finally turning to me. Her face was pale, and I could see her lips trembling as she whispered, "They're not going to stop." I didn't know what to say. My dad had been gone for weeks, and the few times he'd called, it was only to mumble vague reassurances before hanging up. "I'll fix this," he'd said once, but how? He wasn't here. We were. And now, it felt like we were the ones paying for his mistakes. We didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside made us jump, a car passing by, branches scratching against the window, even the hum of the fridge sounded ominous. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud knock at the door. My heart felt like it stopped. My mom grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway, motioning for me to stay quiet. The knock came again, louder this time, and then a voice, "Police. Open up." My stomach twisted. No way. Not again. My mom whispered, "They're lying." We stayed still, pressed against the wall, barely breathing as the knocking continued. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, we heard heavy footsteps moving away from the house. When the footsteps faded, I finally exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. From my bedroom window, I caught a glimpse of a car parked across the street. It was an old sedan, unremarkable except for the fact that it had been sitting there all day. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now it felt like a threat. I nudged my mom, and she followed my gaze. Her face hardened, and without saying a word, she grabbed her phone and called the local police. She explained everything, about the men pretending to be detectives, the threats, the car outside. The officer on the other end said they'd send someone over, but his tone didn't exactly inspire confidence. When the real cops arrived, it was almost 4 a.m. A single patrol car with 2 officers. They took our statements, but when my mom described the men, they just exchanged a glance. "We've had reports like this," one of them said, scratching the back of his neck. "Debt collectors sometimes impersonate law enforcement to intimidate people." Debt collectors. The words made my chest tighten. This wasn't random. These men weren't just opportunists. They were after my dad. When we mentioned the car across the street, the officers checked it out, but it was empty. No plates. No sign of anyone inside. They didn't seem too concerned and left after telling us to call back if anything happened again. As soon as they were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even with all the lights off. The next morning, my mom decided to call my dad. It was something she'd avoided doing since he disappeared, but after everything that happened, she didn't see another option. She used the landline, and I could hear the tension in her voice as she left him a voicemail. "They came to the house," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to fix this, or we're not safe here." She hung up without waiting for a response. Hours passed, and we heard nothing. I tried to focus on normal things, schoolwork, chores, but the unease was unbearable. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see those men walking up the driveway again. Around noon, my dad finally called back. My mom answered on the first ring, but she didn't put him on speaker, so I could only hear her side of the conversation. "Where are you?" she demanded. "Do you know what they've been doing?" She went quiet for a long time, nodding slightly as he spoke. Then her face changed. First confusion, then anger. "You need to stop running and face this." "We can't," her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand over her mouth. When she hung up, she looked at me with this hollow expression. "He's hiding," she said finally, her voice flat. "And he's not coming back until he figures it out." She didn't explain what that meant, but I could tell it wasn't good. The day dragged on with an unbearable tension hanging over us. My mom tried to act normal, cooking dinner and cleaning as if nothing had happened, but I could see how jittery she was. Every time the floor creaked or the phone rang, she'd flinch. I kept checking the windows, half hoping the car from the night before was gone, but it wasn't. It was still parked across the street, like a shadow we couldn't escape. By late afternoon, the anxiety was eating me alive, so I decided to step outside, just for a breath of fresh air. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed something on the porch, a white envelope taped to the doorframe. I called for my mom, and we carefully peeled it off, our hands shaking. There was no name, no address, just a single piece of paper inside. It read, "We'll be back. Make sure you're ready." That was it. No explanation, no signature, just those 7 words. My mom stared at it for what felt like forever, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "We're not safe here," she whispered finally. I didn't know what to say because I knew she was right. She grabbed the envelope and burned it in the sink, her movements frantic. The smell of burning paper filled the kitchen, and for the first time, I realized how real this was. It wasn't just a bad dream or a passing threat. This was our reality now. That night, neither of us could sleep. My mom stayed by the living room window, peeking out from behind the curtains every few minutes, while I sat on the couch, trying to stay awake. We kept the lights off, hoping it made us less noticeable, but it only made the house feel colder and more hollow. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. My stomach flipped. I looked at my mom, and her wide eyes told me she'd heard it too. We both froze, straining to listen. Then came the knock. 3 loud, deliberate bangs on the front door. I could feel my pulse in my ears as my mom motioned for me to stay put. She grabbed the baseball bat we kept by the door, her hands trembling so hard I thought she might drop it. The knocking came again, this time faster, more impatient. We didn't say a word, didn't move any closer. Whoever it was didn't announce themselves, didn't try to force the door. They just kept knocking over and over, until the sound echoed in my head like a drumbeat. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, it stopped. We waited, hearts pounding, until we heard the crunch of gravel again, this time fading into the distance. When morning finally came, the first thing my mom did was call a locksmith. By mid-afternoon, we had new locks on every door and reinforced bolts, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The fear wasn't just about someone breaking in, it was about knowing they could come back any time they wanted. That car was still across the street, unmoving, like a predator waiting for the right moment. My mom called the police again, but it was the same story. They filed another report, gave us another lecture about staying vigilant, and left. I could tell even they didn't know how to help. By evening, I was exhausted, but the paranoia wouldn't let me rest. I was sitting in my room, staring at my phone, when I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Tell your father we're done waiting." I stared at the screen, my hands cold and clammy. How did they even have my number? My mom's phone buzzed at the same time, and I knew, without even asking, that she'd gotten the same message. That was the moment I realized there was no escaping this. They weren't after us, they were using us to get to him. And as long as my dad stayed hidden, we were the ones who'd have to deal with the consequences. By the time night fell again, the tension was unbearable. My mom decided we needed to leave, at least for a while, to clear our heads and figure out what to do next. We packed a couple of bags and loaded them into her car. She told me to wait inside while she started the engine, just to be sure everything was fine. As soon as she turned the key, the horn blasted, one long ear-piercing sound. It wasn't the engine at all. The horn just kept blaring, non-stop, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. My mom jumped out, her face white with panic, and I ran outside to meet her. That's when we saw it. A note, taped to the windshield. It was just like the one from before, the same plain white paper with bold, blocky letters. "Running won't help." My mom snatched it off, her hands shaking so badly she nearly ripped it. She shoved it in her pocket, muttering under her breath, and told me to get back inside. The horn eventually stopped on its own, but by then, the neighbors had started to peek out of their windows. We were too humiliated to explain anything, so we just locked ourselves back in the house. That night, we didn't even try to sleep. Every light in the house stayed on, and every sound made me jump. The following morning, the car across the street was gone. At first, I thought it might be a good sign, like maybe they'd finally given up. But my mom wasn't convinced. "It's never that simple," she muttered, pacing the living room. She kept looking out the window, her eyes scanning the street like she expected them to pop out from the shadows at any moment. By now, the strain was wearing on both of us. She hadn't eaten in days, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt normal. Later that afternoon, the landline rang. My mom hesitated before answering, letting it ring several times. When she finally picked up, she didn't say anything, just listened. Her face went pale, and she turned to look at me, covering the receiver with her hand. "It's him," she whispered. My heart sank. She pressed the phone against her ear again. "You have to fix this," she said firmly. "They're going to hurt us." I could hear my dad's muffled voice, calm and detached, like he wasn't talking about the mess we were in. Then, she froze. Whatever he said next made her hand drop to her side, and she just stood there, staring blankly at the floor. When the call ended, she didn't tell me what he'd said. She just whispered, We're on our own now. That night was the worst. My mom tried to keep it together, but I could see her unraveling. She moved furniture in front of the doors, triple-checked the windows, and even pulled out a kitchen knife, leaving it on the table just in case. I couldn't bring myself to ask what she thought she'd have to do with it. We sat in silence for hours, waiting for something to happen. The waiting was almost worse than the events themselves. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a warning. Around 3 a.m., we heard it again, the sound of gravel crunching. My mom's eyes met mine, and we both froze. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, louder than before. This time, there were no voices, no fake claims of being the police. Just the knock, repeating over and over. My mom whispered for me to stay down, but I couldn't help myself. I crawled toward the living room window and peeked out through the edge of the curtain. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A group of 3 men standing at the door, their faces barely visible under the dim porch light. One of them was holding something, a crowbar or a pipe, I couldn't tell. We didn't open the door. We didn't say anything. We just sat there in the dark, praying they'd leave. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. I heard footsteps, but they didn't fade this time. They moved toward the side of the house. My mom grabbed the knife, her knuckles white, and motioned for me to follow her into the hallway. We crouched there, listening as the sound of footsteps circled the house, pausing by each window. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow move past the crack under the door. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. We stayed huddled in that hallway until dawn, too afraid to move. When the sun finally came up, we found muddy footprints by every window and a crowbar lying on the front porch. No note this time, no message. Just the lingering feeling that they could come back any time they wanted. My mom called the police again, but they didn't have much to say. They took more notes, shrugged, and left. To this day, I don't know who those men were or how far they were willing to go. My dad never came home, and we eventually moved, hoping to leave it all behind. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that knocking again. Slow, deliberate, just like before. And I can't help but wonder if it'll ever really stop. Mount Robson hiking group's mysterious disappearance. I still can't decide if going on that hike was the best or worst decision of my life. It was late August, the air already carrying that crisp edge of fall, and I joined a small hiking group for a weekend adventure at Mount Robson. I'm not what you'd call an experienced hiker. Weekend trails, sure, but nothing as ambitious as summiting the tallest peak in the Canadian Rockies. I'd signed up with a friend of mine, Derek, who swore up and down that the views were worth the grueling trek. There were 8 of us in total, mostly strangers, a couple in their late 40s who seemed like seasoned pros, 2 college-aged guys who wouldn't stop joking about bears, and an older woman with an authoritative air, like she'd done this 100 times before. Then there was the fast group. 5 people, all experienced hikers who decided to push ahead early. It was the fast group that first set the tone for the day, their enthusiasm infectious as they sped off ahead of us about an hour into the hike. We'd agreed to meet at the summit for lunch, so it wasn't a big deal that they were moving quicker. They left behind a trail of boot prints in the damp soil, their voices fading as they rounded a bend in the trail. The weather had been unpredictable all morning. Blue skies one minute, low, heavy clouds the next, but as we climbed higher, something felt off. I can't explain it well, but the air felt heavier, almost electric, like the moments before a storm breaks. Derek joked about it, saying we'd better not end up on some unsolved mysteries documentary, but the older woman, her name was Ellen, shot him a sharp look. "People have disappeared up here before," she said. By the time we reached the midpoint of the trail, the fast group was nowhere in sight. Their footprints were still visible, though, pressed into the loose dirt and gravel. It was strange, though, they looked oddly spaced, like they'd started walking in a hurry. We stopped for a break near a small stream, the sound of the rushing water the only noise cutting through an eerie silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally so. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just us and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot. Ellen muttered something about the weather changing quickly in the mountains, but even she seemed unsettled. I remember glancing at Derek, who was always the loudest guy in any group, and noticing how quiet he'd gotten. They probably reached the summit already, he finally said, but he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, slower now, the unease growing with each step. About an hour later, we came across something none of us could explain. The footprints ahead of us stopped abruptly. Just stopped, like whoever made them had been plucked straight out of the air. We stood there, staring, the trail stretching ahead completely untouched. Ellen crouched down, running her fingers over the last visible print. "It doesn't make sense," she whispered. There were no side trails, no scuff marks, nothing to indicate they'd gone off the path. Then, as if on cue, the weather shifted again. The sky, which had been a dull gray, turned a sickly greenish hue, and a low hum, barely audible at first, seemed to pulse through the air. "Let's keep moving," Ellen said, her voice tight. But nobody moved. The hum got louder the longer we stood there, an unsettling vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical, but with this strange organic undertone, like a heartbeat. Derek finally broke the silence, muttering, "This is some X-Files crap," and started walking ahead. Reluctantly, the rest of us followed, our unease palpable. As we climbed higher, the air grew thinner, but not in the usual way. It felt harder to breathe, like every inhale was being filtered through something unnatural. Ellen kept glancing at the sky, her face pale and drawn. I tried to shake the growing dread, telling myself the fast group was probably waiting for us at the summit, laughing about how slow we were. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew we weren't going to find them. When we finally reached the summit, it wasn't what I expected. There were no panoramic views, no celebratory cheers. Just an eerie, quiet desolation. The air was still humming, faint but persistent, and the greenish tint in the sky hadn't faded. There was no sign of the fast group. No gear, no water bottles, no footprints leading back down. Just the last pair of prints, frozen mid-stride where they'd disappeared. I walked to the edge of the ridge, hoping to spot them somewhere below, but the drop was sheer, and the valley below was shrouded in a strange, swirling mist. "We need to get out of here," one of the college guys said, his voice shaking. For the first time, Ellen didn't argue. She just nodded and started back down the trail, her pace quicker than I'd seen all day. The descent felt even worse than the climb. The hum was still there, growing fainter the further we went, but the unease it left behind clung to us like a second skin. We didn't talk much, everybody seemed too focused on getting off the mountain. About halfway down, Derek stopped suddenly, staring at something off the side of the trail. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but when I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. Stuck in the mossy ground was a single boot, the leather scuffed and weathered like it had been out there for weeks, even though it hadn't rained in days. Ellen crouched to inspect it, her face grim. "It's one of theirs," she said, barely above a whisper. The weird thing was, it wasn't like someone had just left it behind. It was lodged deep in the dirt, like it had fallen from a great height. We left the boot where it was. Nobody said it out loud, but we all had the same thought. Something wasn't right, and we didn't want to stick around to find out what. As we continued down, the atmosphere grew heavier again, like the mountain itself didn't want us to leave. Then came the snapping. At first, it sounded like twigs breaking off in the distance, but soon it was everywhere. Sharp, irregular cracks echoing through the trees. Ellen stopped dead in her tracks, her head tilted as if listening for something. "Stay close," she said, her voice trembling. I'll never forget the way her face looked, pale and tight, like she was bracing for the worst. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but where would we go? The snapping grew louder, closer, and now it wasn't just twigs. It sounded like something heavy moving through the forest, breaking branches as it went. But the weirdest part? We couldn't see anything. The trees were dense, but not so thick that something making that much noise should be invisible. Derek grabbed my arm, his hand clammy and shaking. "This isn't an animal," he whispered, as if saying it too loud might make whatever it was notice us. Ellen motioned for us to keep moving, her normally commanding demeanor replaced by sheer panic. We started down the trail faster, practically jogging now, but the snapping stayed with us, shadowing our every step. It didn't matter how far we went, it was always the same distance away, like it was following us without ever getting closer. We broke into a full sprint when we saw the clearing where we'd started that morning. Relief hit me like a tidal wave, but it was short-lived. Just as we reached the edge of the trailhead, the humming came back, louder and deeper this time, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. It was like the mountain itself was alive, its heartbeat pounding in time with the hum. The sky, which had cleared briefly as we descended, darkened again, that sickly greenish hue spreading like spilled ink. "Keep moving," Ellen yelled, her voice breaking for the first time. We didn't stop until we were back in the parking lot, collapsing near our cars in a breathless, terrified heap. The humming stopped the second we left the tree line, the air suddenly normal, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. We sat there for a while, catching our breath, none of us daring to speak. It was Derek who broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell was that?" Nobody answered. What could we say? Ellen finally stood, brushing the dirt off her pants. "I'm calling the park rangers," she said, pulling her phone from her pack. But when they arrived an hour later, it was like trying to explain a bad dream. The fast group's tracks, the humming, the snapping, it all sounded insane when said out loud. The rangers hiked up to the summit to investigate, but by the time they got there, the weather had cleared, and the trail looked normal. No footprints, no boot, nothing to prove we weren't just a group of over-imaginative hikers spooked by the altitude. The official report listed the fast group as missing, likely victims of environmental exposure or some other vague explanation. But I know what we saw, or more accurately, what we didn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened to them wasn't natural, and a few weeks later, I came across something online that made my blood run cold. Articles about human feet washing ashore in British Columbia. Detached, still wearing hiking boots or sneakers, and always untraceable to any living person. One of the photos showed a boot eerily similar to the one we found on the trail, half buried in the dirt. I haven't gone hiking since that day, and I never will. Sometimes I still hear that hum in the back of my mind, low and steady, like a warning. Whatever is up on that mountain, it's still waiting.